David Brister here with another chord play, and this is the Chords of Porcupine Tree. And Porcupine Tree, originally formed in the late 80s, and then in the early 90s, Stephen Wilson from Porcupine Tree began releasing albums, and he started working with some musicians, and then a band formed, and then the initial band, known as Porcupine Tree, eventually changed. As we crept into like the 2000s, the band kind of changed. Gavin Harrison started playing drums with them, um, and the group kind of evolved. So it's an interesting kind of musical journey because they started very progressive rock, very kind of similar to like early Pink Floyd and kind of the Sid Barrett era, and then they morphed into like more like an alternative rock band, and then near the end of their cycle they kind of became more like a hard rock progressive group. So if you're not really hip to Porcupine Tree, or you don't really know Stephen Wilson's music, there's a lot to consume. It kind of began in the early 90s, I think like around 92 93, and then it's continued on, and definitely Stephen Wilson's been very busy releasing albums under his own name. So Porcupine Tree kind of disbanded, and I did get to see Stephen Wilson back in 2013, and that was in Chicago, and it was a marvelous show. And I'm such a huge fan. I'm actually going to save that story. That includes the third time I got to meet Guthrie Govan. But I'm going to save that story because I like Stephen Wilson's music enough. I'm probably at some point in the future going to make a Stephen Wilson chord play. And definitely Stephen Wilson himself has worked with a ton of groups. Whether it's songwriting and recording music, or also producing and engineering and mixing music too. And the first example is from the song Deadwing, which comes from the album by the same name. And this is a really interesting, chord selection and performance of chords. And this is another reason why Porcupine Tree is perfect for chord play, because the chords and their music are really interesting. So it starts off with this C sharp minor 11. And you can see, if you think back to some of our open-ended bar chords that we've talked about, it kind of looks and feels a little bit like F sharp minor, but there's some open strings, and we're not really using the low E string there. So it's just the fourth fret on the A, fourth fret on the D, and the second fret on the G. The B and the high E are open. So that's going to give you that C sharp minor 11. Now that chord's going to basically relocate. The fourth fret we have on the A and the D is going to move to the third fret, and that's going to create a C major 13. So that's going to look and feel like E major, up a fret. Don't play the low E string, but you do want to play the high E and the B open, and there's the C major 13. So you've got this really cool, just kind of slid, partial chord. And there at the end of that little sequence, he keeps the chord shape down, that C major 13. He picks through it. And he's also introducing the ninth right there, the D note, against that C, which creates a really interesting tonality. All right, the next example comes from the song Waiting, Phase 1, which is on the Signify album, which is that one. And that's one of my favorite Porcupine Tree albums. And you can see I've switched to an acoustic guitar. Now, hopefully I didn't psych you out, when this episode started, because I had electric. And then now the remainder of this lesson is going to stay on acoustic. And some of you might be like, no! But I really do want to show some of the interesting, chords and textures and voicings that appear in their music. And just from kind of working on some of their music and also Stephen Wilson's music, there's a lot of acoustic guitar. I think he writes a lot of his songs on acoustic, and then maybe filters it over to electric, or he includes electric and acoustic. And even though some of the songs we're going to look at in this lesson, maybe they start with an acoustic guitar and then eventually electric guitar takes over. But this particular song has a very challenging chord sequence. And even if you're thinking, well, man, this, chords are easy, or acoustic guitar is easy, or whatever, trust me, this is not easy. So the first chord we're going to play, it's actually an F sharp minor 7. But it's performed in a very unusual way. So think of an F sharp minor, bar chord. But we're also going to include E there on the B string on the 5th fret. And then it's going to change to an F sharp minor 6, and that E is just going to basically move back to a D sharp. So you have this nice little, two chord exchange led by the pinky. And then it's going to move to a D major 7, just a regular, kind of open position. But then the tricky part is moving from that D major 7 back to the F sharp minor 7. So if you don't believe me, grab your guitar and try that, because that's a tricky chord progression. Even though it sounds simple and it looks kind of easy, when you put your fingers on the fretboard, it's like, whoa, I've really got to kind of think about, that chord progression. All right, the next example comes from the song Trains, and you can see I'm still on acoustic, and now I have a capo at the 5th fret. And even though the chord progression in this song is very familiar, you should notice the chords we're using here. The important thing to know about this song and the tonality and the influence of Porcupine Tree, even though a lot of people aren't aware of the band, their music and their sound and their ideas filtered out into the pop and prog and rock world, and you can hear songs that sound kind of like Porcupine Tree, and usually it just means that somebody kind of borrowed the influence or kind of borrowed their sound, because these guys have been around long enough. They've saturated and influenced a lot more musicians than you actually realize. All right, so this is interesting because, with the capo, I'm going to refer to the chords, relative to the capo, but we're kind of starting with this D sus2, then it kind of moves to a C add 9, and then eventually it's going to move to an E minor 7. So these 3 chords have appeared in tons of pop and rock songs, especially acoustic guitar. But there's something interesting that Stephen's doing with the D. He's kind of lifting the A note off and playing the open G. Something like that. It's obviously, a really cool guitar part. But the next example comes from Fear of a Blank Planet, which comes from the album of the same name. And this is a very interesting guitar part, and it's a rockin' tune, but the intro starts with acoustic guitar. And there's kind of a valuable lesson from listening to the guitar part in the song and then trying to really, uncover, how it was played. Because if you listen to the song, you distinctly hear this rapid, kind of aggressive, acoustic guitar being played. And if you really listen to it, you can tell he's playing it with all downstrokes. So there's no alternate picking with this. It's all down. It's very accented. It's very, it's driving, you know what I mean? So it just starts with a D octave, and it's all downstrokes. Also, the song's in 6/4. So Porcupine Tree is obviously a prog-rock band. So, the chords, the time signatures, there's key changes, there's all sorts of things happening in their music. It starts off with this D octave, and it looks and sounds something like this. So you're basically just playing that open D against the D on the 7th fret there on the G string. And notice I'm picking everything with downstrokes. And then the flat 5 is introduced, and that A flat's right there. So then it would be like a D5 over A flat, or a D flat 5 over A flat. Anyway, it's just a 2-note dyad, but it's played the same way as the first part. So right there you got this. Then, that A flat basically moves back to a G, and then your middle finger is going to cruise over here and grab the 6th fret on the B string, and you're going to have this. Which that's basically like a G7 with no third, kind of. But you're playing it that way. And this is interesting. So now you're reaching over and grabbing, that F note there on the B string. And then after you play that pattern, these 2 fingers are going to flip. So now your index finger is going to go to the 5th fret on the B, and your middle finger is going to go to the 6th fret on the D. After we've moved from that G7, it does kind of move to like an E7 over G sharp, you know, when it flips that fingering. And then when you put all that together, it's a really interesting guitar part. Right, now this is the interlude from the same song, and there's another interesting series of chords here. So keep in mind it's in 6/4, so the rhythm or whatever is going to be a little funky, but it's a really cool part. So you're starting with this. It's a really interesting little chord there. So it's like a D5, but it's a flat 5, because normally you'd have an A, and here we've got an A flat introduced, which is weird. So we're picking through it. The sound of that chord progression, you know, that D flat 5, you know, real moody and kind of dark, and then a D flat 5 with a B flat in the bass, and then D flat 5 with a B in the bass, and then back to the, you know, D flat 5 over B flat. The last examples from the song Arriving Somewhere But Not Here, and that's one of my favorite Porcupine Tree songs. It's a great kind of haunting tune, and it came from the album Deadwing, which Deadwing's a concept album about a ghost, and I believe the main, you know, character in the story, I believe the ghost is actually that character's mother. I think that's how the story goes. So there's this kind of feeling of loss and isolation and loneliness, and you know, it's a very deep album. It's definitely not, you know, your casual, you know, just throw it on for the family kind of thing. It's like, no, you're going to sit down and listen to that and think about it. There's a couple interesting things you can learn from this song, and it's very slow. It's arpeggiated. There's a D sus2 that starts it. It's going to move to a D augmented, which we've actually featured that augmented chord in several Chordplay episodes. You know, Tool, and there's several so far. So we're really just going to move that A up to an A sharp there on the G string. And this is like a 12-minute song, so there's like a long kind of keyboard intro, and you hear, you know, these little, you know, kind of melodies and things on an acoustic guitar, and then finally you kind of hear that intro fade in. This is one of the points in the song that you're going to learn something. So we were in open position, you know, moving between D sus2 and that D augmented chord, and then now we're going to make this move up to this D shape here, which is going to function technically as a D minor 7. And most of you that, you know, saw that chord progression unfold, you would probably play it like this. But the lesson to kind of learn from this song is this is one of those situations where that's the, you know, the next chord in the tune, but then it's going to descend this little, you know, melodic pattern on the G. So you don't really want to be stuck. I mean, I guess you could stretch down and, you know, almost snap your index finger off there. But the more logical way to do it would be to use kind of an unusual fingering for the D. And I've kind of taught myself to play it that way. Playing through those chords, you know, there's that D minor 7, and then a D minor 6, and then a D minor flat 13, technically. And then it changes to a D add 9 sharp 5 with that last little chord. And it's only played once, but that's such a cool sound. Definitely use that in a song somewhere. I like that chord. That's going to wrap up this episode, and you know, leave some comments and feedback, and please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back with some more 3-for-all and chord play and material before you know it. Thank you.